No matter its actual narrative content, every movie is a ghost story. This is the No Fear Podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 10 of season 6, and we're continuing our series about found footage with a discussion of Gemma Files' novel, Experimental Film.
All right, so I'm going to kick it off with a little bit of information about Gemma Files, since I think this might be the first time we've really talked about her in depth. And then a little bit about this book, this publication history and such before we jump into our discussion. I'm really curious to know what you guys thought of this. So a little bit about Gemma Files. She was born in 1968 in London, England, but she grew up as a child and now lives in Canada, specifically in Toronto. And before she became probably one of the best weird horror writers we have out there today, at least I think so. She worked in journalism. In particular, she worked in film journalism. So I bring that up because this book is, I think, really interesting. It kind of mirrors her life in a lot of ways. You can tell that it's a deeply personal book. There was a podcast that I listened to a few years ago and where she talked about writing this book. I want to say it was the This Is Horror podcast, probably 28. I don't know. I'd say maybe 2018, but I'm just guessing. I really don't know what year it was that she was on the podcast, but she was talking about this book and just talking about how really truly personal it was for her, because she was a writer, but she hadn't really been doing a whole lot of freelance writing at that point. And she was really interested in film history, in particular into like this kind of Canadian film history that's discussed in the book a lot. But she also wasn't getting to write a lot of the stuff that she wanted to with that either. So she was at home with her husband and her son. Now her son is on the autism spectrum, like the son in the book. So she drew on some of her experiences for that, which I think really makes this book pretty unique. It's one of the things I really enjoy about it, but I won't jump into that too much. As far as this book was published in 2015. Now, she'd been writing since the 90s when she first published her horror short stories. And she'd written other books, but this book in particular was published in 2015, and it won the Shirley Jackson Award for Best Novel, and it also won the Sunburst Award for Best Canadian Speculative Fiction in Novel Work right after it came out. So this one has gotten a lot of well-deserved attention for her. I will also say, this is one of the fun things I think about this book. You can tell she did a lot of research, not just in like Canadian film history and that side of it, because that's just such a rich setting that she gives us in the book, this like small community of film historians. But she also did a lot of research into the mythology that she builds the book around. So I was not aware, but Lady Midday is an actual folklore character. So it comes from Slavic mythology of like Eastern Europe, that kind of region. And Lady Midday is described in the same way that we kind of see her in the book. She comes out in the middle of like hot summer days when people are working in the field. She has the scythe with her, and she will punish those who she feels like deserve to be punished. A lot of times, I mean, if you look at the lore around it, people are probably describing what we would probably call heat stroke. But that's when they would talk about Lady Midday, or the Noon Witch, as they sometimes called her, coming out. She's described as less of a witch character and more of like a demonic character, like an avenging angel sort of. So I found that really fascinating that Files did so much research into this and the way she kind of weaves it throughout the book. But I don't want to jump into that too much. I want to turn it over to Matt and Mel and hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I guess I'll go first here. To be honest, it took me a while to get into this book, and I'm not sure what it was. For me, it was something about the writing style. It seemed like the way maybe some people I know would talk, but it didn't feel natural. I guess it felt a little stilted, and that may go back to her having a history with writing in academia and journalism as well as a film critic. But I don't know, it felt a little stilted at first, and so it took a little bit for me to get into it. But once I did get into it, I do really like the book. I like what it was doing. I liked the themes of it. Even before I looked into more background on Gemma Files, I could tell that it was a pretty personal book, just in the way that the main character is characterized, not just the way that the character speaks about her time as a journalist and as a film critic, but also her son who is autistic. I didn't look to see if Gemma Files has a child that is autistic. It would not surprise me if she did, but if she doesn't, she probably sounds like she knows someone who does, because it was very personal feeling. Like it felt very, very real and sort of raw, even how honest the main character was in her conflicting feelings about having a child with special needs, where she both loved him but also could get very, very frustrated by him at the exact same time, and then would question herself whether or not she was a good mother because she was so frustrated. And it was just a very, very real portrayal of something, and I wasn't expecting that. I did kind of go into the book fairly cold. I think it was you, Lisa, that suggested it as we were discussing this series. And yeah, so I just, bought it from the Kindle bookstore and started reading it, not knowing much about it. And I found it overall to be really good, really poignant, really moving in places. And there were some definite twists towards the end that I was not quite expecting. And overall, I was satisfied, despite the fact that it took me a little while to get into it. I think that was just more me kind of just responding to the writing style, and it's not a criticism of it, to be honest, because once I did get into the book a couple of chapters in, I did really start to enjoy it. And I actually just finished it a couple of days ago before we started recording, because I was trying to time it so it would still be very fresh on my mind, because I knew I was going to start something else after I finished this one. But then I ended up finishing it this weekend, like Saturday afternoon, because I was like, no, I have to finish it now. I can't wait till Sunday or Monday. So yeah, those are kind of my overall thoughts. I know it started off kind of sounding like I was coming out the gate hot and not liking it, but overall I really did like it, and I found myself surprised by it. And I don't want to get too much into the plot yet either, but I'm sure we'll get there. So Mel, what are your thoughts?
I really enjoyed reading this a lot, and I think it fits perfectly with this theme that we're doing on found footage. And I know I was thinking at the beginning of the series of found footage, when Lisa and I were talking about the ways that books participate in this, I thought it would be really cool if we could mix genres. So I'm glad we were able to do this. Yeah, I too wanted to delay finishing it until closer to recording, but I think it was like Friday or Saturday. I was like, I got to finish this because I need to know what happened. So I just sat down and knocked it out. Let me see. I could see how it might be slow to get into. I actually read the first couple chapters and then had to put it aside for work stuff. And when I got back to it, I was like, okay, I need to kind of review this a little bit. But once it picks up, I was totally in. I like the idea of following a writer, a journalist who had been a professor at some point, I don't know. It was interesting seeing the connections I was seeing with this person just to myself, but I also could tell as well that this was probably a personal character for Files. I like the idea of seeing the person, the way that the story unfolds, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, but the main character witnessing this thing that she thinks is fascinating and could be something to write about, and then the way like her obsession with it and with writing about it kind of weaves into her life as an escape, but also just this mission she feels. And the idea of her doing the research and getting the grant and collaborating, all that was like fascinating to me to see that kind of step by step wrapped up with the idea that this is a horror film. So I enjoyed that. I also enjoy the use of the weird too. Like I do like weird fiction, and this idea of the folklore of Lady Midday being like like they call a small god with that it's these kind of gods that don't kind of go away and get picked up in folklore, and maybe are mad that, that people don't really worship them anymore. And it's not quite like a Lovecraftian pantheon of gods, but it plays with it in really interesting ways, I thought. And I also just thought the main character was so complex. Like you were saying, Matt, the love for the son and the frustration with the son, the frustration with herself as a mother, the frustration with her own mother, and the frustration with herself and the way she sees herself and her son. I thought that was so well done. It made this character who could be very prickly and unlikable, which is fine, but have a vulnerability. And the fact that the book is written kind of by this person as like almost like a memoir of this experience comforted me in knowing that she was probably going to survive, but also let us into her, I think, in a way that we would not have been able to get had it just been straight up third person about what was going on. And before I pass it back to you, Lisa, for your impressions, I also just loved all the various ways that there was found footage, quote unquote, in the book, from the book that you're reading to all her research to the films to, I felt like almost every time I turned the page, I had a new kind of example of found footage, because it was this great like postmodern puzzle that our main character Lois is trying to put together about the disappearance of this woman who was interested in the occult, and in the, it was like the early, it was like the late 1800s and early 1900s, and just all the directions it went in. And so I don't know, this like was in so many parts of my reading wheelhouse, it's hard for me to even list all of them. I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, that was one part that really kind of drew me into. And it's funny because, we chose this because we're talking about found footage, and we wanted to look at something that was in a different medium than just movies. And so we had talked about, well, maybe this would fit. And I agree with you, Mel. A lot of this fits within my wheelhouse exactly. Like, I love the idea of cursed media, which the movie and the film is that in a lot of ways. The Untitled 13 that she, becomes obsessed with because she thinks she sees something there that she wants to find out more about, and that she wants, to connect to what happened with Mrs. Whitcomb. But the Untitled 13 in and of itself is this kind of cursed object in that, it envelops her life. And there's a lot of talk throughout the book about like how she hasn't been okay really since she saw it. And I love that idea, which I'm sure we're kind of going to get into, the idea of what happens when you see something that you're not supposed to, and that you can't undo that, because there really is no way to take back that action. There's no rewind button on seeing something. And so already that has me hooked in. And then there's the added mystery on top of that of Mrs. Whitcomb, and the idea of like a hidden woman's history, that like maybe she was one of the first female filmmakers, but something happened to her, but she was also into like spiritualism. And so there are seances and connections with spirits, and maybe connecting with things she shouldn't have connected with, and before her disappearance. So right away, even that in and of itself, okay, I'm sold. I'm in. But I also really enjoyed the way you were describing, Mel, how the book is this kind of postmodern found footage, because the way the main character is walking us through her journey of investigation is really kind of fascinating, because sometimes it is things she's hearing, or it's the documentary that the other woman is working on, or it's her interviews with people, or it's her at home, which is the parts that I really connected with were like the parts where she was at home with her husband and her son, but her mind was being pulled toward this obsession that she had. Matt, I agree with you. I think it made it difficult to read at times, but that almost seemed intentional to me, because I mean, just as somebody who is a researcher and who is an academic, and you don't even need a cursed film to become obsessed with something. You know what I mean? Like for like a film or a book or some kind of art object to become an obsession, I feel like is so easy for those of us. I mean, all three of us have been in the academic world at different times. Some of us are still more firmly planted in that, but it feels like it was one of the most accurate representations of what it feels like to be so obsessed with something that you're researching and not being able to pull yourself out of it. That, I don't know, I just really appreciated that. And so that was one thing that did kind of connect with me with this, but it also made it difficult to read too, because I don't know, Mel, you used the word prickly to describe the main character. I don't know if I would say that, but like, you know, she does have a singular focus, which I think does make it difficult to have relationships with other people, even under the best of circumstances. And she doesn't always have the best of circumstances like most of us. So I don't know. There was a lot in here that I loved. And then once I was sucked in, I kind of felt her obsession, and I felt that need to get back into the book when I wasn't in there. So yeah, those are my my kind of initial thoughts. Maybe we should talk about, I mean, a little bit of the plot of the book and like the horror elements of it. We certainly, I think, need to talk about the film, the Untitled 13, which in and of itself is composed of stolen footage. So it's a found footage film that has been kind of cobbled together to make something new. I don't know. Y'all want to talk a little bit about how that worked in the book, since we've been talking about found footage this whole time?
Yeah, I think that would probably be a good idea there. Also, we may need to just back up too and just kind of do a plot synopsis for those of you listeners who haven't read this book. We've kind of been talking around it, but I guess first of all we should just say spoilers. we may give some spoilers, but just the basic overall plot. You've got this main character Lois, who, as you said, Lisa, becomes obsessed with finding the source for this footage for this film that she sees. Another character named Rob who apparently is a rich and a bit of a jerk, and known for plagiarizing is probably the best way to say it. But she attends a screening of one of his new movies, the Untitled 13 that Lisa mentioned. And in it, there's this segment that really captures her attention, that she does some research on, finds that it's tied to this woman, Mrs. Whitcomb, who disappeared under very strange circumstances from a train in the early 1900s. This was several years after her son disappeared and was presumed dead. And so that kind of sparks the obsession for her. And she basically, like any true academic, goes and gets a grant to do research to write a book about this because she wants to not just delve into it, but as she researches it, learns that Mrs. Whitcomb could very well be one of, if not the first female Canadian filmmakers. And so that's how she gets her grant money. And through all of this is where she discovers this tie to this Lady Midday demon goddess. I don't know how you describe her, minor god, deity, that basically she becomes increasingly convinced is real and is in some ways influencing and not talking, but trying to interact with Lois's life as well. And so does that sound like a good plot synopsis? I don't want to give too much away at the very beginning. We can probably give another spoiler warning when we get to the end of the movie, but I think that's kind of a good overall thing. There's like you all said, good found footage aspects here of the footage from Mrs. Whitcomb that was literally found in a forest that was then incorporated into a found footage sort of pastiche by this Rob character. But am I leaving anything out, anyone? Anything like just major plot points for the listeners?
No, I don't think so. I think that's a pretty good synopsis of kind of how it gets started. I mean, the rest of the book is her unraveling what's actually going on, and she learns that through doing her research, as any good academic journalist does. I would add that they found some of the films that had been thrown in, what was it, like a hell hole or a demon hole or something, which
basically, yeah.
I mean, if I found some, also it's silver nitrate silent film footage, so it's very volatile. And that's another interesting thing, is that there's a lot that's ambiguous in this book. I mean, I think we know what happened at the end, but there's a bit that's ambiguous because of the circumstances that befall certain people. But yeah, the fact is, so if somebody throws something in a hole to hell and you find it, you probably shouldn't take it. I mean, this is like straight up M.R. James academics finding stuff they shouldn't have found and being cursed, because curiosity is always punished in horror.
Well, and I would even say that for me, like Lisa mentioned in her initial thoughts, that the idea of the cursed object, which, I mean, obviously that's a big thing here with the film footage, especially since and this is a plot point, it does cause issues, especially with the main character, with Lois. She begins having seizures, and those are not always directly from viewing the footage, but I mean, there's definitely this implication that she has seen something that she shouldn't see. And I feel like I was trying to pin down kind of a, my 10-second overview kind of of this book, and it sort of feels like a spiritual successor to both The Ring and House of Leaves, minus all the postmodern writing style of House of Leaves. But yeah, kind of those two things of the found footage that opens up a doorway that's also a cursed object that really leads to things that no one was expecting or wanted.
I love those two comps. It definitely has a feel of both of those. I guess I'll add to the synopsis. I'll talk just a little bit about what the films are. I don't know, listeners, if you're afraid to hear what the images were because they could be cursed, you can always fast forward here. But it turns out that the Untitled 13 isn't the only iteration of this Lady Midday character in the possible first female filmmakers oeuvre, which they find in the hellhole. She has this Lady Midday legend repeat a few times. So the main image, which it seems, if I'm looking back on it right, almost everybody in the book who sees it has something terrible happen to them. And there are a few people who are so scared they won't look at it. Like they just get creeped out by looking at it. So it's like a field, and this kind of mirrored veiled character comes out and asks people like what they're doing or like how they're doing with their work. And so the legend is that if you don't look at her and you just basically get on with what you're doing and you're working hard, she won't hurt you. But if you look at her and you're belligerent or rude, or you're refusing to do your work, you get punished. It reminded me a little bit of, I believe there was like some Icelandic cat monster thing we talked about with Christmas supernatural stuff back a few years ago, where like if you're not prepared for winter and you don't have enough food laid in and clothes, it'll get you. It's like this idea of like, if you're not doing your work and doing what you need to do to survive in this environment, this god character is going to take you out. But she's also pretty fickle because she just wants worship and respect. And so the first one is a field, and I think there's a child, and the figure comes out, and it's not 100% clear what's going on. And I think I think she might have a scythe at that point. There's another one where the character has a sword, I think, and another one where she might have like shears. I feel like there was something scissor like. So there's a few different iterations, and it's kind of the same thing happening each time, but the weapon is different. It's like she just keeps playing this out over and over again, teasing this one image or one idea and seeing the different ways she can deal with it. And each time there's like these different almost like kind of effects, like almost like mirror effects. And we don't know precisely what Miss Wickham is doing at the beginning of the book, but we start to kind of feel like we know toward the end, because she is kind of frustrated by and then grieving the loss of her son. And there are some interesting parallels there. So yeah, I feel like we need to actually talk a little bit about that cursed image. And then, yeah, like as the book goes on, Lois starts having seizures and almost like heat stroke symptoms, to the point where she actually loses her sight at one point, and she often loses her memory and needs people to show her the documentary footage she has so far so she knows what happened. And then when she loses her sight, she needs people to explain to her what was happening. So that was interesting to me too, having the main character have to go through those kind of tribulations, because it was forcing us as readers to get our information maybe through different mediums too. Lisa, have Matt and I synopsized what we needed to?
I think so. I particularly liked your description of the actual cursed films that come out of the hellhole. I'm glad you brought up the parallel between, I think, Mrs. Whitcomb's son and the relationship that is going on there, and the desire to connect with the lost son that Lois is going through most of the book, because her son, I mean, we've mentioned like he's on the spectrum, but he can really only communicate with them through catchphrases he's heard on the television. And so I think that there's this idea of like disconnect and loneliness within relationships. That is a really interesting theme that kind of goes throughout. And, you know, of course, it's only magnified by everything that Lois goes through, you know, in her course to find the truth. But I think there's also something really interesting in the Lady Midday character that we see in the films, because it's not just the idea of like us seeing, or the characters in the book seeing the film, but there's this really eerie thing that Gemma Files describes of like, I don't know, almost like she can, it's like not just you seeing, but it's you being seen. That is kind of where this like horror, I don't know if you want to, I mean, it's definitely weird. It definitely falls into the category of weird, but it is almost this like cosmic kind of horror that I think she pulls out there, is this idea of seeing something but then also being seen, which I found really fascinating. I feel like just by the very nature of this book, our discussion of it is probably going to be very fragmented, because the whole book itself kind of is purposefully, and I don't know, it may just be that, but yeah, good job with the synopsis so far.
Well, and I like what you just said it there about that aspect of being seen. I think that's an important part of the novel, because it's not just, I mean, I think that's kind of a lot of cursed object kind of things, is that the thing that you look at, the thing that you unleash even, is something that has seen you. I mean, if you think of like the puzzle box from Hellraiser, or something like that, when you solve the puzzle box, it's not just that you can look into hell, it's that they look back at you. And I think I agree with you. The way that Files describes almost the act of being seen is really well done. And it's also, I don't know quite how to say it, but I guess, having never had the experience myself, I feel like it would be a realistic portrayal, the way she describes it towards the end of the book, of basically seeing and being seen by this deity, because there is this aspect of not just that the film is a cursed film, but that it can act as a kind of a doorway or a bridge between Lady Midday's sort of realm and here, because what I think is really fascinating, and it's kind of this recurring theme throughout the novel, is Lady Midday is described as appearing when the minute becomes the hour, like right at high noon. And one of the problems with that, though, is that it's always high noon somewhere on the planet, so she's always somewhere. But also the idea that making a film, you are capturing a discrete moment in time, like a specific moment in time. And so even if I'm watching stupid schlock, if I'm watching Fast and the Furious 6 or something, I'm watching something that happened. It's not happening. It happened at a specific point, or points, because it's been edited together. And that's something that's always, I mean, I think there's a lot of room for further exploration. Other potential horror writers, if you're listening, the idea of film capturing a specific moment in time. And she kind of combines those two ideas to have this, I mean, if the film was created at noon at a time when Lady Midday would be present, then watching the film in the right circumstance could actually create this doorway to opening, to communing actually with the actual Lady Midday. All that's to say, though, that leading up to the sort of climax of the book, there really is this sense throughout that the people, not just Lois, but Mrs. Whitcomb, and later, I'm drawing a complete blank on his name, and I don't know why, but the elderly man who was the blind spiritualist who was able to help capture Mrs. Whitcomb's memory onto actual film, they've all been seen by Lady Midday. There's this sort of very interesting idea that he's not allowed to die because Lady Midday has seen him and isn't quite through with him yet. She's keeping him alive. He's still aging. He's like 102, and his body is still getting older and falling more and more apart. But the fact that he's been seen by her is enough to trigger the fact that he's not able to die. He wants to. He's like, I'm tired. I just want to go on, but I can't yet. She won't let me. And so, yeah, sorry, I think that was a whole lot of stuff I just threw out there, but I think that idea of being seen is really captured well, and she describes it really well. And yeah, anyway, don't anger minor deities, guys, especially if they have seen you. That's kind of the overall motto, I think, for the book.
Yeah, just ignore them. If you can't hide from them, ignore them or go about your business. do your vocation. It's like demons. You don't want to mess with them. No, I love what you guys are saying about, it's not just seeing something, it's being seen. And I love, Matt, that you bring up the twist of the book, because for most of the book, Lois thinks she starts to figure out is that you saw a forbidden thing. And she says, that's so hard because we want to see, right? Like, even if somebody tells you something's horrible, you still have that human curiosity to, like, I think she says, like, prove it, or like prove it's there. And some people are turned off and don't look at it, but it's if you're a minor deity that wants to, like, break into the world, like, that's a pretty good way to do it. She probably should have found a better film medium. Of course, I guess it gets digitized, so it's okay. But yeah, I love that. The idea that, I saw something terrible, therefore something's going to happen. And we find out partway through the book, like you were saying, Matt, that Lady Midday has this whole, like, game, like plan B con game thing, like, going on underneath, like targeting certain people so that she can come back and be more powerful again, keeping Sidlow, I guess that's how you pronounce his name, alive so that he can continue to use his ESP memories onto film technique to keep her going, choosing Mrs. Whitcomb in a weird way so that she would unwittingly create this door. Because, yeah, it's not just a cursed object, it's a swinging door. And there was this part in the book that really struck me where Miss Whitcomb is trying to explain to her husband why she has to do this. And she says, I saw, I shall never unsee nor be unseen. So what I know must be told somehow by any means. I must remove it from my head, translate it to the heads of others. And so, she's basically she tries seances to connect with her son and figure out what's going on. That doesn't work. And she feels like Lady Midday's connected to the disappearance of her son. And so she has this idea of, if I can translate this memory to film, then I could maybe use it as a way to communicate with Lady Midday and find out what happened to my son. And that's the moment when she realizes that Lady Midday manipulated her in a way into using this technology so that she could come back, even if it takes her like 100 years or something. She's patient, like these deities often are. The other thing that I thought while you were talking, Matt, about all the different people who have been seen by Lady Midday, is the thing that I find really terrifying in this book, amongst many, many, many terrifying things, is that Lois's son Clark sees and is seen by Lady Midday and has no idea what that means. And even though he's a kid and completely ignorant of it, he still is possibly going to face the ramifications of the forbidden thing, just because these things are connected to Lois, and those levels of responsibility and fear and terror, it really upped the ante, I think, in the horror in the book. I mean, not like everything else is horrifying too, but once her son becomes inadvertently involved, it just makes it so much worse, I feel like. And it makes Lois know that she has to do something. Even if she makes the wrong choice, she has to do something.
Mel, I want to follow up on something that you were talking about with Lois and her son, and how his interactions with Lady Midday, or the fact that he's seen her and been seen by her, and that puts him in danger. How it really kind of highlights how unfair this all feels. And I think this is when the book kind of comes the closest to like what I would call cosmic horror, like the idea of just that there's this thing out in the universe that is pretty much uncaring. I mean, I don't know what to call Lady Midday. Like we've called her like a goddess, a demon, a small god, something, a deity, whatever she is. She's part of this, like, she's part of the universe that just takes, she's willing to be patient, like you were talking about, Mel, like kind of just sit there and play the long game and get what she wants. And it has, to me, like a very uncaring, unfair feeling about it. And I think we feel that the most when we see the son. And I'm going to kind of fast forward a little bit towards the end, because this is when we get a lot of the interaction with Lady Midday, when she's kind of basically saying, she's telling people she's saying, feed me, love me, and die of it. Feed the earth, make it grow, do your duty. And that's something that has been repeated, I think, earlier in the part I'm looking at, is when it was kind of repeated, like, see and be seen by me, and do your duty to, feed me. Yeah, earlier she says, all I want is your toil, your duty as promised. So many others ask for much more. And we see Lois kind of reckoning with what it means to be Clark's mother in a really interesting way. And, she's talking about, and we've learned throughout the book just how some of the difficulties she's had being a parent to Clark without having like the social skills that were needed, or even like the speech to be able to like connect with her on that level and say, like, I love you. And she's often had this dream that like one day, and I think it's even referenced really early in the book when she's talking with her husband Simon, like the idea that like one day he would just kind of suddenly catch up with where he was supposed to be and be able to completely communicate and talk. And, how wonderful would that be? But she comes to kind of the realization, I think, through Lady Midday in a really interesting way, where she says, that's not my son. And I thought that was a really, I don't know, I thought that was a really kind of poignant thing, that she realizes that making her son different wouldn't, I mean, it would change who he is, right? Like it wouldn't be Clark anymore. It would be a different version of him. And I don't know, I thought that was a really kind of interesting arc that she followed. It was a really, that was, I don't know. I'm not making much sense talking talking about it, but it was something that I've been kind of rolling around in the back of my head on this read of the book.
No, I like that idea of what you're talking about there. Because, yeah, I mean, Lady Midday is a kind of god. And she's like, I'll just give you what you want. And then you can let me into this world, because Lois is standing up against her. And, Lois quotes her collaborator's grandfather and said, they take what's already ours and then offer it back to us at twice the price. They're bountiful and cruel at the same time. The sort of gods whose attention brings inspiration inseparable from torment. And she also has a quotation that she remembers from Zora Neale Hurston about, all gods dispense suffering without reason, otherwise they would not be worshipped. And she basically says, like, if you give me that version of my life where I don't have these complexities and these issues, it's not real, like you said, Lisa. So she denies it. She wants the reality, I guess. But then she also says, even if you gave me that, it would be at the expense of all the people you would kill, because they wouldn't know their vocation or whatever. I mean, there'd always be something that was displeasing her. I mean, they talked about how when she first began as a small god, Lady Midday demanded that they sacrifice the elderly because they couldn't work like the other people, and their blood would make the crops grow or whatever. And sometimes they would also sacrifice children. And I think Lois is like, this is just a trick, like the trick of the mirrors in the film, to come back into the world. It's like, even if you protected me and gave me everything I wanted, it wouldn't be real. It would just be a reflection. It could be taken away at any moment, and it would sacrifice all these other people. And I don't know, I thought that was a really interesting moment where she kind of sees through what Lady Midday has been doing, or at least tries to. And it also makes her see, like you were saying, Lisa, just some things about her life more clearly. And then, of course, she's kind of saved by Rob's bunglingness in the end, because he wants a god to take care of him and give him what he wants, I guess. I don't know. I mean, he kind of selfishly throws himself in the way. But yeah, I thought it was interesting. I mean, I think you could say, oh, this is like a Deus Ex Machina ending where she gets everything she wants. I don't think so. She's not that massively. She's changed enough after facing down a Lovecraftian deity with bloodlust. But I do find it interesting how the deity tries to almost like victimize her with her own life, and yet she still refuses. And that was a really interesting moment to me.
Well, and I think the acceptance of her life, warts and all, is kind of part of Lois's journey there. I mean, it's not that she was so struggling against her life, but I think she wasn't recognizing what she did have quite the way that she does at the end of the book. And I mean, she says that she, I don't remember the quote. I don't have I can't find it in front of me, but basically she realizes that her husband is probably one of the few people in the world who is capable of loving her for how she is, because she knows that she's prickly and off-putting and a little odd, and maybe even a little on the spectrum herself, she thinks. And so she, has a deeper realization and appreciation for him, as well as, yes, she has gone back to sort of freelance writing, because she started out as a freelance writer and then she was teaching film, and then that kind of blew up in her face. And when the place where she was teaching shut down. And I mean, it seems like overall, like there was a lot Lady Midday could kind of wave her wand and make everything better, but that wouldn't be her life. The Clark that wasn't autistic wouldn't be her Clark. And as someone who's ended up in a place now where I never expected I would be 10 years ago, I can definitely relate to that a lot. It wasn't always an easy journey getting to where I am now, but if somebody was like, and not like my life is perfect. I definitely have trials and stresses and issues and whatnot, but I can very much relate to that. Oh, well, what if I wave this wand and everything that was bad in your past is gone and everything is perfect for you now? Well, but I wouldn't be me anymore, and the people around me wouldn't be the people that I know either, because we've all been shaped by those experiences. So yeah, I found the ending pretty satisfying and fitting for that reason there. That, I mean, she does come to a place of acceptance of her life. Does that make her a perfect mother going forward? No. And I think she realizes there will still be times where she loses her patience with Clark, and there will still be times where she thinks, oh my God, if you could just speak without speaking in quotes from things that you've watched. She'll have those thoughts, and that's what makes her human. And taking away those imperfections just to please a deity so that they can be worshipped the way they want, that helps nobody. And so I liked that quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think she would just end up, I like that idea of like she's accepting her life as it is, but she would just end up as the deity's puppet in a way, which is pretty terrifying too.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you accept the gift from the deity, that doesn't mean that the deity can't in the future threaten to take it away if you step out of line, or what they see as out of line. If a little ways down the line, if she's not helping worship Lady Midday the way Lady Midday wants, I mean, I can take it all back. I can make everything the way it was before. I mean, that definitely, that's a huge threat hanging over her that I don't think she would want to live under that. And I don't blame her. I mean, it's a gift with many, many, many strings attached, to the point where it's really not a gift so much as a manipulation anyway.
Yeah, and it goes back to that idea too of, that was the refrain we kind of heard with Lady Midday, was do your duty. There's always going to be a duty to her. And from everything I've seen in the book, I I don't think I would want to walk into that relationship of, make sure you're doing your work and your duty, because it's probably not pleasant, whatever she's expecting. So yeah, I'm absolutely with you on that one. Yeah, I have to say, Lady Midday sounds like, but before I read the book, knowing absolutely nothing of the mythology, Lady Midday sounds like some sort of, I don't know, like she's in some sort of like Chaucer tale and is probably very pleasant. But after reading this, I just never want to come in contact with her or any of her other small gods that might be trying to do a similar thing. But I really do enjoy this book, and I'm glad we got a chance to talk about it. I guess that's where we're going to call it day or night whenever you're listening to this podcast. We are at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon and get access to exclusive content. I'll go ahead and put a little asterisk there to say that we did end up using some of that Patreon money to commission some new artwork. So if you're listening in your whatever podcast app you're listening to, you can look and see that new art. I think it's fantastic. It's inspired by those vintage horror paperback covers from like the 70s. It looks great. We used it to actually make some merchandise that you can get on our website. So if you head over to www.nofearcast.com, remember that's KNOW, you can find some of that merchandise and maybe get a little No Fear merch to help us, spread the word about this podcast. Of course, we completely understand if you can't support us on Patreon or buy any merchandise right now. It is, I think, difficult times for a lot of people, and that is absolutely okay. We do our best to keep this content free, but what you can do to help us out is rate and review us. That is entirely free for you, but it does help other listeners find us. Theme music is by Nicholas Gasparini. Thanks for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.